A few months ago, someone sat down at a keyboard, opened a chatbot, and typed in a simple request. Read the entire Bible, all 66 books, every chapter, every verse. And tell me if you notice anything strange about the way it's built. What came back wasn't a contradiction. It wasn't an error. It was a shape, a structure so precise, so symmetrical, and so consistent across authors who never met, who lived centuries apart, who wrote in 3 different languages, that even now scholars are arguing about what it actually means. This is that story. And by the end of it, you're going to look at one of the most read books in human history in a completely different way. Let's set the scene properly, because the details matter here, and I'm not going to feed you a fairy tale. The AI in question is Grok, built by Elon Musk's company xAI. It's a large language model, which means it was trained on enormous amounts of text, including centuries of biblical scholarship, commentary, translation notes, and literary analysis. When someone prompts Grok to analyze the Bible for patterns, it isn't reaching into some secret vault of forbidden knowledge. It's doing something more interesting than that. It's rapidly cross-referencing structural patterns across an entire 66-book library in a way that would take a human scholar years, maybe decades, to do by hand. And what it kept surfacing over and over in different conversations with different people was the presence of a literary structure so old that it actually has an ancient Greek name, chiasm. Here's what a chiasm is in plain language. Picture a mirror. You start with an idea, you move through the story, and at the very center, you hit a turning point, a climax, the core message the author wants you to sit with. Then, instead of the story simply continuing in a straight line, it starts folding back on itself, echoing the earlier themes in reverse order. The beginning rhymes with the end. The second point rhymes with the second to last point. And the whole thing builds toward and then mirrors away from one central idea sitting right in the middle, like the hinge on a door. Ancient writers loved this technique, and not because they were being mystical or secretive. They used it because it worked. In a world before printing presses, before books you could flip back through, storytelling had to be memorable. Oral cultures needed structure that helped an audience hold an entire narrative in their heads. A chiasm did exactly that. You could lose a few details and still remember the shape, and the shape would carry you back to the meaning. Scholars have known about chiastic structure in biblical texts for a very long time. This isn't new. If you've ever taken a serious course in biblical literature, you've probably heard your professor point out that the story of Noah's flood is built as a tightly balanced mirror, with the turning point sitting exactly where the floodwaters begin to recede. You may have heard that the book of Leviticus, dense and legalistic as it seems, actually pivots around its center chapters, dealing with atonement, wrapped in matching layers of ritual law on either side. Individual chiasms inside individual books are old news in academic circles. Nobody is shocked by that. What made people sit up when Grok was asked to look at this is something bigger, something scholars have debated for decades without ever fully agreeing on. Whether these smaller mirror structures are actually pieces of one much larger pattern that spans the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, from the first page to the last. Think about what that would actually require. The Bible was not written by one person in one place over one lifetime. It was assembled over roughly 1,500 years by dozens of different authors, editors, and communities, writing in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek across radically different historical periods. Bronze Age herders, exiled poets in Babylon, fishermen and tax collectors in Roman-occupied Judea. These weren't people coordinating on a shared outline. Many of them never read each other's work. Some of them lived 1,000 years apart. And yet, when you lay the whole collection out and trace its major themes, several biblical scholars, independent of any AI, have long noted a strange symmetry. It opens in a garden with humanity in unbroken relationship with its creator, innocent, walking freely in creation. It closes in Revelation with a new garden city, humanity restored to unbroken relationship with its creator, walking freely in a renewed creation. In between, the story descends into exile, brokenness, slavery, and separation, hits a series of dark turning points, and then slowly, painstakingly, works its way back toward restoration. Israel's captivity in Egypt echoes, generations later, in Israel's captivity in Babylon, almost as a matched pair on either side of the story's long arc. Themes that appear early: a flood that judges the world, a tower that scatters humanity, a promise made to one family that's meant to bless all families, get picked back up and resolved on the far side of the narrative, like the second half of a mirror finally catching up to the first. When Grok was asked to map this out, working through the text at a pace and scale no single human reader ever could, it didn't invent these connections out of nothing. What it did was surface and organize them with unusual clarity, tracing the intensity of certain themes rising and falling across the whole collection like a wave, cresting somewhere in the middle chapters and receding again toward the end in careful, deliberate symmetry. People who watch this laid out describe the same reaction over and over. It's one thing to be told in a lecture that the Bible has a chiastic shape. It's another thing entirely to watch it get mapped out in front of you, book by book, theme by theme, and see the pattern hold. And here's the part that actually deserves the word "can't explain," because I promised you I wouldn't oversell this, and I meant it. The individual chiastic structures inside individual books, those scholars can explain. Ancient authors use the technique on purpose. It's documented. It's taught. Nobody disputes it. What remains genuinely actively debated in biblical scholarship is the larger question. Is the symmetry across the entire collection, spanning nearly 40 different authors across 15 centuries, the result of later editors and compilers deliberately arranging the books to create this shape? Is it the natural result of ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman writers, all drawing from the same shared cultural toolkit of storytelling techniques, so that similar shapes emerge without anyone planning the whole thing? Or is it something else entirely, a kind of emergent coherence that nobody fully engineered, and that shows up anyway? Those three explanations aren't fringe theories. They're the actual positions serious scholars hold, and they disagree with each other. Some point to the very real historical process of canonization, the centuries-long human process by which religious communities decided which books belonged in the Bible and in what order, and argue that later editors, consciously or not, shaped the collection's structure the way you'd arrange chapters in an anthology, gravitating toward material that echoed and completed itself. That's not a supernatural explanation. It's a human one and a compelling one. Other scholars push back and note that chiastic structure appears not just in the Bible, but across the wider literature of the ancient world, in Mesopotamian poetry and Homeric epic, in ancient legal codes, suggesting it may simply be how storytelling minds across many ancient cultures naturally organize long narratives, the same way certain rhyme schemes or three-act structures show up independently in unrelated storytelling traditions throughout human history. And then there's a smaller, more contested group of scholars and theologians who look at the scale and precision of the pattern and argue it's harder to fully explain through editorial history or shared literary convention alone, especially given how tightly some of these mirrored themes align thematically as well as structurally, not just in obvious places, but in smaller, easy-to-miss details that seem to have been preserved for centuries of copying without collapsing. None of those three camps has definitively won the argument. That's not a failure of scholarship. That's what an open, honest, ongoing academic debate actually looks like. And it's exactly why watching an AI lay the pattern out with fresh clarity reignited a conversation that professors, rabbis, and pastors have been quietly having in seminar rooms for generations. What's genuinely new here isn't the discovery of a hidden message. It's the tool. For most of history, tracing a pattern like this required a scholar with decades of training, fluent in ancient Hebrew and Greek, spending years cross-referencing thousands of pages by hand, often relying on concordances and index cards. Today, a language model can process the entire text, hold every verse in relation to every other verse simultaneously, and surface structural relationships almost instantly, in a way that lets an ordinary reader with no seminary training watch the pattern unfold in real time. That's the real story. Not that a machine found a secret, but that a machine put a genuinely old, genuinely respectable area of biblical scholarship directly into the hands of millions of curious people who never would have encountered it otherwise, stripped of academic jargon, laid out plainly, mirror and all. And it's worth sitting with why this hits people the way it does, because the reaction isn't really about the literary technique itself. It's about what the pattern implies. If a collection of ancient texts, written across 15 centuries by authors who had no way of coordinating with each other, keeps circling back to the same handful of themes: exile and homecoming, brokenness and restoration, a garden lost and a garden regained. In a shape this deliberate, it forces a question that has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with meaning. Is that the result of careful human editing across generations, communities quietly shaping their sacred texts to reflect the story they most needed to tell about themselves? Is it evidence of shared human instincts about how the deepest stories are supposed to be shaped? The same instinct that makes tragedy and redemption arcs feel universal across every culture on Earth? Or is it something believers would call design, evidence of a single guiding hand behind many human hands? Grok, to its credit, doesn't claim to answer that question, and neither should anyone pretending an algorithm settled a debate theologians and literary scholars have wrestled with for generations. What it does is show you the shape clearly enough that you have to decide for yourself what to make of it. That's really the heart of why this keeps spreading. It's not a scandal, it's not a cover-up, it's not some ancient secret finally cracked open after centuries in hiding. It's something almost more interesting than that, one of the most scrutinized, most translated, most argued over books in human history, A text that has had every single sentence picked apart for 2,000 years by scholars looking for contradictions and errors still has structural depth in it that a new kind of tool can reveal in a way that makes people stop scrolling and actually pay attention. Believers see confirmation of something they already suspected, that these texts were never meant to be read as a flat, disconnected pile of ancient documents, but as one long, unified story with intention behind its shape. Skeptics see something equally fascinating from the other direction: proof that human storytelling, even without central coordination, tends to organize itself around the same handful of universal emotional arcs, and that sacred texts are, among other things, some of the most carefully preserved literary architecture our species has ever produced. Either way, something real is happening here, and it deserves better than the clickbait headlines circulating about it. Grok didn't uncover a lost verse. It didn't decode a secret warning. It didn't reveal a conspiracy the church supposedly buried for 2,000 years. What it did is quietly, clearly illustrate a structural pattern that biblical scholars have studied and debated for a very long time, at a scale and speed that makes the pattern impossible to ignore once you've actually seen it laid out. The debate about what that pattern ultimately means, human editorial genius, shared literary instinct, or something believers would call divine intention, is exactly as unresolved today as it was before any chatbot got involved. And maybe that's the most honest, most fascinating part of this whole story. The mystery was never actually hidden. It was sitting in plain sight the entire time, in a book more people have read than almost any other in human history. It just took a new kind of tool to make millions of people finally stop, look closely, and notice the mirror they'd been reading straight through for their entire lives. So the next time somebody tells you an AI found a secret buried in the Bible for centuries, you can tell them the real version, the one that's actually true and honestly just as compelling. Nothing was buried. Nothing was hidden away in some forbidden chapter. What happened is that a very old, very real conversation about structure, symmetry, and meaning in the world's most read book got handed a new set of eyes, and those eyes happened to move fast enough and see clearly enough to make the rest of us finally look up and pay attention to a pattern that was there, quietly, patiently, the entire time.